Okay, so now for one of my favorite sections. I love this section. Okay, we are going to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. All right, I just want to remind you what we did in the last section, okay? So in the last section, remember we took the square root of both sides whenever you had a perfect square. So we took the square root, and then we ended up with plus or minus the radical there, okay? And then we simplified that radical, and the radical got rid of the square right there, so we were left with y minus 7. And then we added 7 to both sides. Okay, so we ended up with these two answers. Remember, this answer means y is equal to 7 plus 2 square roots of 3. And we could end up with a decimal there if we used our calculators. Or a table like I used to use in the good old days. And again, but these are exact answers. In case your professor ever says, I want the exact answer, this is what you're looking for, okay? The exact answer is this one. If you are asked to give a decimal, that is an approximate answer, okay? So you need to know the difference between exact and approximate. Approximate means you rounded somewhere. Okay, so I want you to read through this page, but it's really not going to make sense right now, okay? So we are going to look at it at something that has an x squared term plus some number times x, okay? And it says identify your b. So you're going to look at the b, which is the term in front of the x term, okay? And find half of that, okay? So we want to take half of the b number, and then we want to square it, okay? And then you want to add it there at the end. And then what you have just done is you have created a perfect square trinomial. Hang on and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so in this problem they say complete the square to make a perfect square trinomial. Then write the result as a binomial squared. Okay, so we have m squared minus 26m. Now, the first step is you want to identify the coefficient of the number in front of your variable to the first power, okay? So that's this one. So identify this and write it off to the side, okay? So we've got negative 26. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to take half of that number, and after you do that, then you want to square that number, okay? So half of negative 26 is negative 13. And then we want to square that number, which is 169. Now, it says we want to complete the square to make a perfect square trinomial. So we would have m squared minus 26m plus 169. Now we have a perfect square trinomial. I don't know how to write today. All right, now that's part one, okay? Part two says, then write the result as a binomial squared. Okay, since this is a perfect square trinomial, it factors to be m minus 13 squared, okay? And I hope you kind of see where we're going with this. We're actually going to be solving equations using this, but right now we're just practicing writing things as perfect square trinomials and then as a binomial squared. All right, we're going to practice just a little bit more. Sometimes our numbers aren't always the most beautiful numbers, okay? So the last one, you happen to have an even number in the middle, and now you've got an odd number. Okay, so now you identify the term that's in front of the variable to the first power, which now we have negative 9. Okay, off to the side, I'm going to write negative 9. I'm going to multiply by 1/2, and then I'm going to take that number and I'm going to square it, okay? Half of 9 is negative 4.5, and then I want to square that number. So 4.5 squared is 20.25. Okay, so now I want to write this as u squared minus 9u plus 20.25. okay? Then it says, write the result as a binomial squared. So this would be u minus 4.5 squared. Okay, just like I said last time, sometimes you don't always get pretty numbers that are in that term or that are the coefficient of that middle term. So this is one of those cases. All right, so we want to identify the coefficient of the number that's in front of the variable to the first power. So that's 1/2. I'm going to write it off to the side. I'm going to multiply by 1/2, and then I'm going to take that number and I'm going to square it, okay? So I end up with 1/4 squared, which is 1/16. Okay, so I'm going to add that here to the end. All right, now we've just created a perfect square trinomial. So this factors to be p plus 1/4 squared. All right, so now if you want to actually solve a quadratic using the completing the square method, you're going to do those steps that we just did, and then we're going to use, starting at step 4, we're going to use the square root property like we did in the last lesson, and then you move on and you keep doing what we did in the last lesson. So let me show you what I mean by that. All right, so let's take a look at this. So I've got x squared plus 8x is equal to 48, okay? Now, I left a little bit of a space here because I know I'm going to add or subtract something to this in order to make this a perfect square. So again, I'm going to identify the coefficient of the the coefficient of the term that has x to the first power, okay? So that's an 8, a positive 8. I'm going to write that off to the side. I'm going to take half of that, and then I'm going to square that number. So then I would have 4 squared, which is 16. Now, to write this as a perfect square, I need to add 16 here. But remember, what you do to one side of the equal sign, you have to do the exact same thing to the other side of the equal sign to keep it balanced, okay? So now we can write this right here as because it's a perfect square trinomial, we can factor it into something that looks like this. And then we add 48 plus 16. And I get 64. Okay? So now I want to do what we did in the last lesson. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I'm left with x plus 4 over here and plus or minus 8. All right, so now I'm going to add, not add 4, that's silly. I'm going to subtract 4. So x is equal to 8. I cannot write. 8 minus 4, and x is also equal to negative 8 minus 4. So I end up with 4 and negative 12. Now, can we check our work? Totally. Let's do it. Let's put in 4 right here and here. All right, so I would have 4 squared plus 8 times 4, and does that equal 48? 16 plus 32 equals 48. Yep, 48 equals 48. So that one does work. Let's try the other one. So I would have negative 12 squared plus 8 times negative 12. Does that equal 48? Negative 12 squared is positive 144. 8 times negative 12 is negative 96. 144 minus 96 is 48 today. Yay. All right, so these are great answers. So x is equal to 4 and negative 12. All right, so now we're just going to practice, okay? So we've got y squared minus 6y. Again, I'm going to leave a space there. Now, identify the coefficient of the y to the first power term. So that's negative 6. I'm going to write it off to the side. I'm going to multiply it times 1/2. Take that answer and square it. So I end up with negative 3 squared. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So I would add 9 there. What you do to one side, you got to do the same thing to the other side. So now the left side factors to be y minus 3 squared. And now I can take the square root of both sides. So I'm left with y minus 3 on the left and plus or minus 5 on the right. And then I would add 3. So I end up with y is equal to 5 plus 3, which is 8. And then y is also equal to negative 5 plus 3, which is negative 2. So my two solutions are 8 and negative 2. All right, I'm not going to check this just for the sake of time, but please understand that on these problems you can definitely check your work. All right, let's take a look at this one. So I've got x squared plus 4x, leaving a space, negative 21. So I take my middle term, or what will be my middle term, identify it off to the side, multiply it times 1/2, and then square it. So I would add 4, okay? So I end up with x plus 2 squared. Let's see here, that would be negative 16. But check this out, taking the square root of both sides. I can't take the square root of a negative number. It won't allow me to. Try it on your calculator. It gives you an error message, okay? So this would be x has no real solutions. In another math class, if you took this class or another class that was similar in high school, you possibly learned about imaginary numbers. We're not doing those in this class. Just understand that this is a true statement. I'm not lying to you. It has an imaginary solution. It just does not have a real solution. So for right now, this answer is good enough. All right, let's try this one. Okay, so we've got, let's see here, p squared minus 18p equals negative 6. Just because there's a negative number over here does not mean that it's automatically going to be no real solutions, okay? Because once we add some number right here, it might change this to a positive number, okay? So don't automatically assume that just because you see a negative that it's going to be no real solutions. So we're identifying negative 18 right here, so I'm going to write that off to the side, times 1/2, and then I'm going to square that number. So half of negative 18 is negative 9. Negative 9 squared is 81. So check this out. I'm adding 81, which now I don't have a negative number on the right side. Negative 6 plus 81 is definitely not a negative number, okay? So the left side factors to be p minus 9 squared, and then negative 6 plus 81 is 75, okay? Now, if you haven't noticed by now, this number right here is always this number right here, okay? Just so you know before you square it. But you have to keep this number in mind because we have to add that to both sides. That's why you need this number right here, okay? But whenever you factor it, this number and this number will match. All right, now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. All right, so I'm left with p minus 9 plus or minus, let's see here, the square root of 75, 25 times 3, and I can take the square root of 25, which is 5 square roots of 3. I just simplified that, okay? And now I'm going to add 9 to both sides. So my two solutions are 5 square roots of 3 plus 9, and negative 5 square roots of 3 plus 9. All right, so let's try this one. This one looks a little bit different than what we've had in the past. So in order to do this by completing the square, you've got to get these two terms by itself on one side and your constant term alone on the other side. So we would need to subtract 4 from both sides. So I end up with x squared plus 10x is equal to 11. Okay, now I'm going to write this term off to this side, take half of it, and then square that number. Half of 10 is 5, 5 squared is 25. So I would add 25 to both sides, okay? So I end up with, whenever I factor the left, x plus 5 squared is equal to 36. Now I can take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. So x is equal to 6 minus 5, which is 1. And x is also equal to negative 6 minus 5, which is negative 11. So my two solutions are 1 and negative 11. All right, so sometimes things aren't always written in the form that you want them to be written in, and you've got to put them that way. So we want our variables on the left and our constant term on the right. So I would subtract 3n from both sides. So I'm left with n squared minus 3n is equal to 11. Okay, now off to the side, I'm going to write negative 3. Oops, that's fine. I'm going to take half of that and then square it. So 1/2 times negative 3 is negative 3 halves. And I want to square that, which would give me 9/4. Okay, so I want to add 9/4 to both sides. Okay, so now we're going to factor the left side. So we get n minus 3/2 squared, okay, is equal to 11 plus 9/4. I'm just using my calculator for this. And it gives me 13 1/4, but if I want an improper fraction, I can do that. So I've got 53/4, okay? The calculator will give me that answer as well. You just have to know what buttons to push. If you need help with that, let me know. Okay, so now we're going to take the square root of both sides. And I'm left with n minus 3/2 is equal to plus or minus. I can take the square root of the denominator, but not the numerator. And then I would add 3/2 to both sides. So n is equal to 3/2 plus or minus. This is just the short way to write it. You could write it out if you want. Square root of 53/2. Or you could write it like this, since they have a common denominator. Or, because notice this actually is two answers, or you could write it out as separate answers. All of these are the same thing, and if I were to give you a paper test, I would accept any one of those answers for full credit. Now, keep in mind though, this one down here, you have to have both in order to receive full credit. Okay, so just like I said with the last one, they're not always written in a form that, that is good for us or works for us. So we need to multiply this thing out. So I get x squared plus 5x minus 3x minus 15 is equal to 9. Combine your like terms. And then in order to use completing the square, I would add 15 to both sides. So I end up with and that's just to get to the place where we can do completing the square. All right, so now off to the side, I'm going to write 2. I'm going to take half of that, and then I'm going to square that number. Half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. So I would add 1 to both sides. All right? So now the left side factors to b, and the right side is 25. So I can take the square root of both sides, and I am left with x plus 1 on the left and plus or minus 5 on the right. Subtract 1, subtract 1. So my two solutions are 5 minus 1, which is 4, and negative 5 minus 1, which is negative 6. So they would be x is equal to 4 and negative 6. And don't forget, you can check your work. This one's actually not a bad one to check. So 4 minus 3 is 1. I'm looking up here. 4 minus 3 is 1. 4 plus 5 is 9. 1 times 9 is 9. That works. So putting in negative 6 there. Negative 6 minus 3 is negative 9 right there. That would be negative 9. Negative 6 plus 5 is negative 1. Negative 9 times negative 1 is positive 9. So yeah, both of these definitely work. It's always a good idea to spot check your work. Okay, so in order to use completing the square, you need your leading coefficient to be 1, all right? And it's not 1 right now, it's 3. All right, so what we're allowed to do is notice all of these guys have a factor of 3. So I'm going to factor out the 3. Okay, so now I'm going to divide both sides by 3, and that made those go away, right? Okay, so now I'm going to move my constant term to the right. And I'm going to identify that x to the first power coefficient and write it off to the side. I'm going to take half of it and then square it. So half of negative 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is positive 4, so I would add 4 to both sides. Now I can factor the left. And now I can solve it. Okay, so I'm left with x is equal to 2 plus 3, which is 5. And it's also x is equal to 2, remember, because I added 2 to both sides. So, I'm sorry, I didn't show that. 2 minus 3, which is negative 1. So, my two solutions are 5 and negative 1. And don't forget, you definitely can check your work here. You would have to substitute in 5 there and see if you get 0 whenever you do this math. And then negative 1 there and see if you get 0. All right. So here's another one like that last one. The only problem with this one is that I can't just factor a 2 out of here. They don't both have a 2. So what I can do, though, is I can divide everything by 2. I'm going to divide both sides by 2. Okay, so what I'm left with when this first term gets divided by 2, I'm left with simply x squared. And when the middle term gets divided by 2, I'm left with minus 3 halves x is equal to 20 divided by 2. Actually, let me scoot that over. 20 divided by 2, which is 10. Okay, so I'm going to identify that middle term. I'm going to write it off to the side. And once I get that answer, I'm going to square it. So I would have, let's see here, negative 3/4 squared, which gives me 9/16. So I'm going to add 9/16 there and 9/16 there. So my left side factors to be x minus 3/4 squared. On my calculator, I'm just typing this in. 10 plus 9/16. And it gives me a mixed number, but I always like to deal with improper fractions. So I'm turning it into an improper, which gives me 169 over 16, which actually is much nicer to take the square root of. So, taking the square root of both sides, I'm left with x minus 3/4 is equal to 13/4, sorry, plus or minus in front of that. Then I would add 3/4 to both sides. So, x is equal to positive 13/4 plus 3/4, which is 16/4, which is 4. And then x is equal to negative 13/4 plus 3/4, which is negative 10 over 4, which ends up being negative 5 over 2 when you reduce. So my two solutions are 4 and negative 5 halves. All right, last example. All right, and this one is very similar to that last one. Again, I can't factor a GCF out of any of these. So what I have to do is I have to divide everything by 3 so that my leading coefficient is 1. So I'm left with x squared plus 2/3 x equals 4/3. Arg, I did it again. Hold on. Let me leave some space. All right, now off to the side, I'm going to write, sorry, I'm having a rough night. There we go. Okay, off to the side, I'm going to write 2/3. I'm going to multiply by 1/2, and then I'm going to square that number. So what I get whenever I multiply by 1/2 is 2/6, which is 1/3, by the way, which is 1/9. Okay, so I would add our, I'm glad this is the last example. I'm having a rough one of this one. There we go. All right, so the left side factors to be x plus 1/3 squared, because remember, we created that. And remember, this number right here is this number before you square it, okay? All right, now on my calculator, I'm typing in 4/3 plus 1/9, which is 1 4/9, but I like the improper better, which gives me 13/9. Okay, so now I can take the square root of both sides, and I am left with x plus 1/3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 13 over 3. All right, now I would subtract 1/3 from both sides. And this is just like that one where we wrote it in 3 different ways. So we could write it, I'm just going to write it one way for the sake of time. So this is one way to write it, and it does show the both answers there, okay? All right, so that is it for this video. I hope you learned a bunch, and let me know if you have any questions or need any help.